Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we will discuss the articles displayed on the screen from the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 31st August 2019. So let us start our discussion. Now before starting today's discussion, let us take up this question which appeared in the preliminary examination of 2019. So this question reads, the ninth schedule was introduced in the Constitution of India during the Prime Ministership of which of the following? The first is Jawaharlal Nehru, Lal Bahadur Shastri, Indira Gandhi and Morarji Desai. Now in the prelims campus of Polity, it was discussed that the ninth schedule was added to the Indian Constitution by the First Amendment Act in the year 1951. And this First Amendment Act added the Article 31A, Article 31B and 9th schedule. Now this 9th schedule was added to the Constitution to make the laws for acquiring zamindari to be unchallenged in the court of law. And that is why any law which was added to the 9th schedule could not be challenged in a court of law even though they violated the fundamental rights. And clearly the First Amendment Act was passed in the year 1951 when India had its first Prime Minister and he was Jawaharlal Nehru. That is why the correct answer was A. So this was a pretty straightforward and simple question which was asked in the preliminary examination of 2019. Now after this, let us take up the discussion of today's newspaper. Now these articles on page number 1 and page number 10 are related to the merger of banks. So recently the finance minister has announced the merger of 10 public sector banks. Now previously also some of the banks were merged and these were SBI with other state banks and also Bank of Baroda with Dena Bank etc. So this will form a part of the General Studies paper 3 under the topic Economic Development. So in this article we will try to understand what is the logic of merger of these banks. Also, what are the likely challenges that will be faced after the merger of these banks? So first, let's understand what is the news. So in this news article, the government has recently announced a mega amalgamation plan of the public sector banks. And in this, 10 public sector banks will be merged into 4 larger entities. Now this step is mainly aimed at improving their financial health and enhancing their lending capacity to support the growth. Further, besides the merger of these banks, the government also announced an equity infusion move of about rupees 55,250 crores. And this has mainly been done in order to improve their lending capacities. Now this is not the first time that government has announced the merger of public sector banks, and previously also twice the public sector banks have been merged. So this is the third merger which has been announced by the government. And after this announcement, the number of state-owned or the government-owned banks is down to 12 from the present 27 number. So these are few important takeaways from the government's announcement. So after the merger of 10 public sector banks, which all 4 entities will be created? So first bank entity will be by the amalgamation of Punjab National Bank, Oriental Bank of Commerce and United Bank of India. Now after the merger, this newly created bank will be country's second largest lender. Now why have these 3 banks been merged? Because these 3 banks are technologically compatible, because these are currently functioning on the same core banking solution platform, which is the Finacle core banking solution platform. Further, Canara Bank and Syndicate Bank have been amalgamated to create a new entity, and this will be the 4th largest public sector bank. Also, Union Bank of India will acquire the Andhra Bank, and this will become the 5th largest public sector bank. And the last entity that will be created is by the amalgamation of Corporation Bank, India Bank and that with the Allahabad Bank. So this will create the 7th largest public sector bank. However, one of the key benefits of this is that these banks have strong branch networks in South India, North India as well as eastern parts of the country. So some of the inherent logics have also been identified here. First is that these 3 banks were merged because they had technological compatibility, and these 3 banks had larger reach in terms of strong branching networks. So after this, let us understand what was the logic of the government in merging these banks and creating the new 4 entities. So first is that banks have been merged on the basis of likely operating efficiencies, also better usage of equity and their technological platform. So as we have learned, the first 3 banks were merged because of technological compatibility, and this is likely to improve the operating efficiencies. Also, we know that the government has infused equity to the amount of rupees 55,000 crores. So due to the mergers and targeted equity, there will be better usage of such equity. Also, the main objective of this step is to create banks of global level that can leverage economies of scale and balance sheet size to serve the needs of a $5 trillion economy by 2025. Now, presently, the size of the banks is small, and as such, they are not able to lend to large infrastructure projects. So, by merger of these banks, this will create economies of scale and also will create banks which have big balance sheets so that they can invest in large and long-term infrastructure projects. And also, presently, there are too many banks in India which have sizes that are very small as compared to the global standards. And since these banks are of small size as compared to the global standards, they are not likely to grow in the near future or not likely to expand in the near future. And that is why the government is now creating big entities so that they can expand in the near future. Now, besides positive aspects of the mergers of banks, various concerns have been raised by various experts. So, one of the concerns which have been raised is that although the consolidation of banks will improve the scale of operations of the banks and will increase their competitiveness, however, there will not be any immediate improvement in the credit matrix as all of these banks have relatively weak solvency profiles. So, what is meant by this is that although such a consolidation looks attractive at this point, however, most of these banks are already suffering from the problem of non-performing assets. And a merger of such banks which are already having non-performing assets is not likely to improve their competitiveness, and also this will not improve the credit growth in the Indian economy. Now, besides the issue of non-performing assets, there are chances that such a merger will now create more friction. Now, this is mainly because previously when the merger happened, one of the banks was a large bank and the other banks which were merged with that large banks were small in size. However, in the present situation, all of these banks are mostly among larger banks. And all these banks are not necessarily in their strong economic health. Now, although there are some benefits and positives that these have similar technologies and that is why such integration is likely to be smoother. However, because the size of these banks is large as compared to the previous mergers, there is likely to be a bit of friction. Now, another issue is that of human resource integration. So, in this regard, concerns have been raised that initially there will be more focus on management streamlining and human resource integration. And this would impact the loan growth and will reduce the focus on strengthening the asset quality in the short term. This is because initially the main focus of such mergers will be on smooth integration and management streamlining. So in such a scenario, the credit growth is likely to be impacted. Now further, there are chances that after the integration, most of the branches of such banks will be rationalized or reduced in number. And due to this, many staff members or the employees of such banks would fear a job loss. And in such a background, these mergers will create more friction and will not be very helpful to the economy. Now, previously, the Narasimhan Committee, which was created for banking reforms, has suggested or recommended the shutting down of weaker banks, and it had not favored the merging of such weak banks with the strong ones. However, presently, what is being done is that weak banks are being merged together. So in such a scenario, it is highly unlikely that the position or the economic situation of such banks will improve in the short term. Another criticism is that the focus of government has mainly been on merging and creating big banks. However, there has been lack of focus on the governance and management reforms in these banks. So in this regard, the suggestion is that the key reform to be made are at the board level, which includes the appointments which are from the government side or the government nominees. This is mainly because the government nominees in the boards of the banks are generally appointed on the basis of political considerations and not on the basis of efficiency and efficacy. So in such a scenario, professionalism in governance is a key to the success and not just the size of the banks. Now, besides all these issues, it has been argued that a failure of very large bank may have more adverse impact on economy, similar to the one which was witnessed in the global economic recession of 2008. Now, what happened in 2008's global economic recession was that big banks of the United States of America had failed. And in such a scenario, the governments had to bail out such banks because these large banks are considered as too big to fail. Now, as these banks are considered as too big to fail, there are chances that these banks will not follow the norms or the provisions of the central bank authority. And why these banks are likely to do this is because these have the assurance that these are too big to fail and will also get the support of the government in the times of crisis. So, in such a scenario, just creating large banks is not enough, and the main focus of the government should be on improving the governance of these banks. And there should be more professionalism in the governance of these banks. So, these were few points related to the merger of the banks. What was the logic behind such a merger? And what are the likely challenges which are to be faced after such mergers? Now, if you look at the previous year questions which were asked in the preliminary examination, this question in the year 2018 read, with reference to the governance of public sector banking in India, consider the following statements. The first is that the capital infusion into public sector banks by the government of India has steadily increased in the last decade. Now, this statement is incorrect because the capital infusion by the government in the public sector banks has been fluctuating and has not been constantly or steadily increasing. Now, the second statement is that to put the public sector banks in order, the merger of Associate Bank with the parent State Bank of India has been affected. So, as we have learned, one of the main objective of the mergers of the banks is to put the public sector banks in order, and that is why this statement was correct. Hence, the correct answer was B, that is 2 only. Now, further in this article, we have read that the first 3 banks were merged because of the same or technological compatibility, and they are working on the Finacle core banking solutions. And previously in the year 2016, a question was asked which read, the term core banking solutions is sometimes seen in the news. Which of the following statements best describes or describe this term? So first statement is that it is a network of a bank's branches which enables customers to operate their accounts from any branch of the bank on its network, regardless of where they open their accounts. And this precisely is the definition of core banking solutions. However, the second statement that it is an effort to increase RBI's control over the commercial banks through computerization is incorrect. And thirdly, it is a detailed procedure by which a bank with huge non-performing assets is taken over by another bank is also incorrect. Hence, the correct answer here was 1 only and A. So similarly, mergers of the public banks, their objectives and aims should be kept in mind. With this, let's move to the next article. Now, this article on page number 15 is also about the mergers of the banks, and this argues that can 10 weak banks together create 4 large strong banks? And this has been highlighted mainly in the background that 9 banks have non-performing assets of over 5%, which are close to the prompt corrective action risk threshold. Now, if the net non-performing assets of the bank cross the 6% mark, these are set under the prompt corrective action, and various limitations are imposed by the Reserve Bank of India on these banks. Now, this topic will also fall under General Studies paper 3 in the topic Economic Development. So, in this background, let us understand what is meant by prompt corrective action and what happens when a bank is under this prompt corrective action. Now, this prompt corrective action was started by RBI because of the growing numbers of NPAs or the non-performing assets in the banking sector. So, in order to improve the health of the banking sector in India, the RBI started this action. So, the main objective of the prompt corrective action or the PCA was to facilitate the banks to take timely action as prescribed by RBI. And this framework allowed the RBI to impose certain restrictions on the expansions of the branches by banks and also impose restrictions on the dividend distribution by the banks. Now, other restrictions imposed by the RBI on the banks under this framework include capping the bank's lending limit to one entity or sector. This means that bank cannot expose itself to other sectors or any industry over and above the limit which has been decided by the RBI. Further, the framework imposes certain restrictions on the amount of loans that can be disbursed by a bank. It also limits the staff recruitment by the bank. And under this framework, RBI can supersede the bank's board under the prompt corrective action. Further, the banks require prior approval for certain expansion proposals under the PCA. And further, the salaries and the compensation payments to the senior executive officers of the institutions are restricted under the prompt corrective action. And regarding the applicability of the prompt corrective action framework, it is applicable only to the commercial banks. And this prompt corrective action cannot be extended to cooperative banks or the non-banking financial companies, etc. So these are some of the key points that are related to the prompt corrective action of the RBI. With this, let us move on to the next article. Now, this article on page number 10 talks about the surplus transfers from the RBI to the government. And this will also fall under General Studies paper 3 under the topic economic development. Now, this article mainly highlights the two narratives regarding the transfer of surplus from the RBI to the government. The first narrative states that the government has arm twisted the RBI or has forced the RBI to transfer such a surplus. However, a second narrative is that RBI is a unique institution which is backed by the central government. And as such, a huge amount of reserves with the central bank is in the nature of idle cash which could be used for more productive uses in the economy. And that is why such a transfer was justified from the RBI to the central government. So in this background, the author has analyzed the recommendations of the Jalan committee which was created for such transfers from the RBI to the government. Now, various aspects of this surplus transfer from the RBI to the government have been discussed in the previous DNS videos recently. For example, why the RBI pays the dividend to the Government of India has been discussed in the Daily News Simplified of 27th August 2019, that is 4 days back. Also, yesterday in the DNS of 30th August 2019, other aspects and the provisions and the recommendations of the Jalan committee have also been discussed. Also, besides these, why did RBI have higher profits in the year 2018 and 19 has been discussed. So from exam point of view, to understand the basics of the Jalan committee recommendations and why is RBI earning higher profits in the year 2018 can be learned through watching these DNS videos. So please go through these videos and revise these topics accordingly. With this, let's take up the next article. Now, this article on page number 10 has been written in the background of a recent comment by the President of Russia at the G20 summit. And at this G20 summit, he has said that liberalism in the West has now become obsolete. So in this background, author has identified what is liberalism and what is happening in the European countries in the present times and how is the state of affairs in Europe different from that of Russia and China. Now, this political philosophy of liberalism will be a part of the General Studies paper 1 under the topic political philosophies like communism, capitalism and socialism, etc. So let us understand what is liberalism, what is its form and what is its effect on these countries. So the author in this article has defined three fields of the liberalism philosophy. The first is the economic liberalism, second is the political liberalism and third is the social liberalism. So in this regard, the economic liberalism emphasizes on free competition and self-regulating markets. And this economic liberalism has been commonly associated with the phenomena of globalization and minimal state intervention in the economy. Now, this economic liberalism has developed from the laissez-faire policy, which means that the state should have minimum intervention in the economy of a country, and as such, the market should be left free. So this mainly deals with the free competition and self-regulating markets and is also associated with the globalization and minimal state intervention in the economy. The second strand of liberalism is the political liberalism, and it is founded on the belief in progress, essential goodness of the human being, autonomy of individual and stands for political and civil liberties. So this mainly focuses on individual at the center of the politics. And this political liberalism tries to balance between the powers of the state and that of its citizens. Now, one of the examples of the political liberalism in India can be the fundamental rights. And these rights are a check on the tyranny of the state. And these fundamental rights talk about the liberties of the citizens. And lastly, there is third strand which is known as social liberalism. And this social liberalism is linked to the protection of minority groups and also on various social issues, for example, the rights of the LGBT community, and also focuses on same-sex marriages, etc. So mainly there are three strands of liberalism, which are economic liberalism, political liberalism and social liberalism. Now after this, let us understand what has happened recently and how is this policy of liberalism impacting various countries in the world. Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin in the recent G20 summit had said to a newspaper that liberalism as an ideology has now become obsolete. and he said this in the background that the liberal ideas about refugees, migration, and on various other issues were now being opposed by the majority of the population around the world. And also, he has stated that multiculturalism as a policy is currently not effective. So, in this background, let's understand what is currently happening in the European Union, etc. Now, the author in this light has highlighted that Vladimir Putin's criticism has been directed mainly towards the social and the political liberalism of the Western countries and has not been directed towards the economic liberalism. And by asserting that liberalism is obsolete, Putin was indirectly against the policies of the European Union. And some of these policies of the EU were the admission of 1 million Syrian refugees, and which was supported by Germany and EU. However, this move of Germany and the European Union was highly opposed by several countries of the European Union. And one of the major reasons for Brexit was the influx of migrants from European countries into Britain. And the people of Britain were fearing job losses due to the migration of people from other European countries as it was a part of the EU. And that is why majority of the people in the Britain supported the Brexit. Further, the author talks about multiculturalism, and he has defined it as a society where different cultures, races, and ethnicities live together. However, this multiculturalism has been criticized within the European Union itself. And this has been criticized on the basis of liberal policies of EU, which assume that minority groups deserve special measures to protect them from the dominant culture. Now, as EU has been following social liberalism and has also been adopting policies which are providing some special rights to minority groups, and this policy is mainly followed by EU to protect the minority groups from the dominant culture of the majority. However, such a move by the European Union has been seen as a policy of appeasement by the government towards the minorities. And that is why the majority community in the European Union is resenting such a move. And that is one of the reasons why many countries in the EU are opposing the admission of refugees into the European Union. Now, in conclusion, the author has analyzed why is the liberalism failing in European countries. So in this regard, he has said that countries like Russia and China prefer the state sovereignty and nation stability over the individual liberty. So this means that the state has a dominant role and is more important as compared to the individual liberty in these countries. And in this sense, the power of the state mainly outweighs the needs of the few, which means that the majority has a dominant role in these two countries. However, as compared to the Russia and China, the Western countries prefer to balance the individual liberties with that of state interest. However, what has been happening presently in these Western countries is that they have not been able to effectively balance between the individual liberties and that of the state interest. And in these countries, the individual liberties and the rights of minorities have taken over the state interest and are affecting the majority. And that is why, due to the lack of this balance, there is a decline of liberalism. And that is why other countries like Russia and China have started targeting the Western liberalism or the Western concept of liberalism. And by doing this, these countries are trying to promote their own model, which is witnessed in various parts of the world. For example, in the elections in the United States of America, the whites who are the majority are feeling persecuted because of such fears. And that is why they have elected the far-right president in the United States of America. And similar things are happening in the European countries where the conservative people are getting into the government because of such policies. With this, let's move to the next article. Now, this article on page number 9 talks about the collegium which has named the judges for Supreme Court vacancies. This will form a part of the preliminary examination syllabus under the topic Indian Polity and Governance. Now, in one of the previous DNS videos, we have covered the concept of collegium, how are the Supreme Court judges appointed, and how can the number of judges in the Supreme Court be increased. So let us revise from that video all these aspects of appointment of judges to the Supreme Court. Now, this article on page number 1 talks about the appointment of judges in the Supreme Court. And it talks about the full strength of the Supreme Court, that is 31 judges. Now, this is in news because recently the government had rejected or returned the advice of the collegium regarding the appointment of 2 new judges. However, the collegium has again asserted that the government cannot reject the suggestions which have been provided by the collegium. So, regarding the strength of judges in the Supreme Court or the number of judges in the Supreme Court, you should note that originally the Constitution provided that the Supreme Court will have 8 judges only, and this includes 1 CJI or the Chief Justice of India and 7 other judges. So, originally the Constitution provided only for 8 judges in the Supreme Court. However, with need of time, the Parliament increased the number of judges in the Supreme Court. So regarding the strength of Supreme Court, you should note that the Parliament can increase the number of judges in the Supreme Court. So this power is with Parliament and not with the President. So this should be noted here. Secondly, the Parliament can increase the number of judges by an amendment to the Constitution, which will be through a simple majority and will not be deemed as an amendment to the Constitution under the Article 368, which means that this is an amendment outside the scope of Article 368. So the Parliament has the power to increase the judges in the Supreme Court, and it can do so by a simple majority outside the scope of Article 368, and this can be an important fact. And the latest increase in judges was done in the year 2008 by an amendment, and it increased the number of judges from 26 to 31. And these 31 judges include 1 Chief Justice of India and 30 other judges. So presently the strength of Supreme Court is 31. And presently there are 4 vacancies that are lying in this full strength of the Supreme Court. And that is why the collegium has recommended that the government should appoint 4 more judges. However, the government has returned the names of 2 judges. And on this return of the names of judges by the government to the collegium has once again said that the government is bound by the recommendations of the collegium. Now, the appointment of judges of the Supreme Court has been dealt with in the DNS of 12th January 2019. However, let us look at some of the points that were discussed in that video. Now, regarding the appointment of judges of the High Court and the Supreme Court, they are appointed by the President. However, the Constitution provides that the Chief Justice is appointed by the President after the consultation with such judges of the Supreme Court and High Court as he deems necessary. So according to the Constitution, the President cannot appoint anyone on his own, and he has to consult with the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court as he deems necessary. Regarding other judges other than the Chief Justice of India, they are appointed by the President after consultation with the Chief Justice and such other judges of the Supreme Court and the High Court as he deems necessary. So in this regard, the Constitution provides that the consultation with the Chief Justice is obligatory in case of appointment of judges other than the Chief Justice. However, the provisions have not been clearly identified in the Constitution or dealt with in the Constitution. And that is why this matter went to the court, and the court has provided various judgments regarding the appointments of judges in the Supreme Court. Now, the provision of consultation of the President with these judges of the Supreme Court has been a matter of controversy in the appointments of judges. And this matter went to the court. And in the first judge's case of 1982, the Supreme Court said that the consultation does not mean concurrence and it only means an exchange of views. So in short, the Supreme Court said that the executive will have a primacy in the appointments of judges, which means that the President can consult with the judges of the Supreme Court. However, he is not bound by that advice. However, in the second judge's case of 1993, the Supreme Court reversed its earlier ruling. And in this ruling, it said that the word consultation amounts to concurrence, which means that the advice which is provided by the Chief Justice of India is binding on the President in the matters of appointment of judges of Supreme Court. So the advice or the consultation with the Supreme Court is binding on the President. And this was provided in the second judge's case in the year 1993. Further, in the third judge's case of 1998, Supreme Court expanded the scope of the second judge's case result. And in this case, it provided that the consultation of the President with the Chief Justice does not necessarily mean the consultation with Chief Justice only. And it provided for consultation of plurality of judges. So in short, it laid down the principle of collegium system. So this judgment in the third judge's case provided for a collegium system, and it provided for a forum of Chief Justice of India and 4 other senior most judges of the Supreme Court. And this collegium will provide recommendations regarding the appointment of judges. So the second judge's case has provided that for the appointment of judges in Supreme Court, The consultation with the CGI, which the president needs to do, amounts to consultation to concurrence, which means that the government is bound by the advice which has been forwarded by the collegium. And this is the matter which has sprung up in the news article that we are discussing. To further get the details of the appointment of judges in the Supreme Court, you can go through the DNS of 12th January 2019. With this, let's move to the next article. Now, this article on page number 3 reads that severely polluted days in a year are reducing according to a study by the Center for Science and Environment, which is a Delhi-based non-governmental organization or NGO. So this study says that the severely polluted days in a year are reducing in Delhi. However, Delhi still needs to cut down 65% in its pollution levels. Now, various aspects of this study are not important. However, three important things to understand here are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, Air Quality Index, and the SUFFER. So all these aspects have been covered in the Daily News Simplified of 21st August 2019. And in this, mainly you have to focus on the major pollutants which are covered by all these environment indices. For example, the Air Quality Index covers and measures 8 major pollutants. However, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards is for 12 pollutants. And previously, you would be knowing in the year 2016, there was a question related to the pollutants which are measured by the Air Quality Index. So similarly, you can expect a question on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and who has notified these standards. So here it is to be understood that the Central Pollution Control Board has notified these standards under the Air Act of 1981 and not under the Environment Protection Act. So all these minor aspects are important for preliminary examination point of view. So you should go through this DNS of 21st August 2019 and understand all these aspects related to air pollution which were covered recently. With this, let's take the next article. Now this editorial on page number 10 talks about the Brexit and especially talks about a no-deal Brexit. And various aspects of the Brexit have been covered in the Daily News Simplified of 27th August 2019, that is very recently. So you should go through this video and understand the various aspects of Brexit from your exam point of view. Now after today's discussion, you should try and answer these questions, and the answer for these questions will be displayed after 5 seconds. The first question reads, consider the following statements. The first statement is, the number of judges in the Supreme Court can be increased by a constitutional amendment under the Article 368. So this statement is incorrect because the number of judges can be increased even without an amendment under the Article 368. The second statement is that originally the number of judges in the Supreme Court were 15, and this is incorrect because originally the number of judges was only 8. The second question reads, consider the following statements. First is that judges of High Court are appointed by the governor, which is incorrect because the judges of the High Court are appointed by the President of India. The second question reads, pension of the judges of the High Court are charged expenditure on the Consolidated Fund of India, which is correct. So here you should note that the salaries of the judges of the High Court are charged on the consolidated funds of the state. So in this line, the correct answer is B, that is 2 only. The third question reads, which of the following are correct about the prompt corrective action framework of RBI? First is that RBI can cap the lending limit of a bank to one sector, which is correct. And the second is RBI can supersede the bank's boards. Yes, this is also correct. So the correct answer is both 1 and 2. The last question is, which of the following are the benefits of bank mergers? First is the leveraging of economy of scale, which is correct as we have learned in today's article. And the second is better usage of equity and technological platform of existing banks, which is also correct. Hence the correct answer is C, both 1 and 2. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let's move on to the question for the day.